What's up, witches, and welcome to Salem, the weirdest place on earth. My name is Joel, and today we are concluding our series on how Salem went from a town ashamed of its past all the way to Halloween Central, USA. Please take a minute to watch the previous two videos if you haven't already. Like in the last video, a lot of today's information came from the book Salem, Place, Myth, and Memory, specifically Frances Hill's chapter. Now, if you're not familiar with Frances Hill, she is one of the gatekeepers of all things witch city lore, so you'll definitely want to check her out. You can find a link to the book we're using today in the description, and if you buy it, you give us a little financial help, which we would super appreciate. With all that out of the way, let's get spooky, witches. Halloween in Salem is the equivalent of Mardi Gras in New Orleans, Christmas in Bethlehem, Easter in Rome, or the Hajj pilgrimage to Mecca. But in all these cases except Salem's, ancient pagan or religious traditions link the place with the festival. There is no such link between Halloween and this Massachusetts town. These are the opening words to Hill's chapter, and I've got to say, they're actually a pretty decent encapsulation of the entire experience of Halloween in Salem. So let's begin, as Hill does, by looking at Salem as a modern pagan mecca, because that story and the story of how Salem became Halloween Central are actually one and the same once you get into the 1970s. Now, it's important to understand that the cultural linkage between Salem and witchcraft never really disappeared post-1692. The lack of clarity in the aftermath of the trials, due to pretty much everyone except the accused doing their level best to pretend like none of it ever happened, led to many concluding that there must have actually been witches in 1692 Salem. And I'm not just talking about Puritan-era America here either. You can draw a straight line between this perception that there were actually witches in 1692 Salem and that run of Bewitched episodes we talked about in part 1 of this series. You can draw an even straighter line between the beliefs that led to the trials occurring in the first place and the TV show Salem, or Sabrina, or Hocus Pocus, or American Horror Story. Each of these stipulate, or in some cases, goes so far as to be narratively dependent on the stipulation, that there were real practitioners of witchcraft in Salem in 1692. This popular perception eventually drew people to the town who claimed to be practitioners of the craft, and those people would go on to, at the very least commercially, change everything. But the pagans weren't the first to seize on the obvious commercial link between Salem and witchcraft. Prior to the 1970s, there were a handful of businesses who flirted with the idea of the Witch City moniker. These included companies from varying industries like fishing, jewelry, a popcorn factory, an oil firm. Even the Parker brothers, who created Monopoly and a bunch of other board games, had a board game called Ye Witchcraft, but they got rid of it when the citizens of Salem revolted. If only those citizens could see Salem now. But perhaps the first attraction in Salem that we would recognize as somewhat witchy was the home of Judge Jonathan Corwin, more commonly known as the Witch House. Now, this is still the only structure in Salem with any direct ties to the witch trials, as it belonged to one of its judges, Jonathan Corwin. But it wasn't really marketed as such until well into the 20th century. Again, quoting from Frances Hill here, in 1944, city plans necessitated either demolishing or moving the building. They relocated it by a few yards, restored the house, and opened it to the public. The organization renamed the building the Witch House to attract as many tourists as possible. So this happens in the mid-40s, and then about 2 to 3 decades later, just as that Bewitched Salem run is gearing up for release, the now infamous Witch City logo starts popping up on a bunch of different merchandising in town. But look, in truth, we can examine a whole host of elements in this fascinating history. We can talk about the witch trials, Bewitched, attempts to commercialize the tragedy that pop up here and there, the rise of Halloween in general, the Crucible. We can examine each of these things in depth and assign some minimal level of responsibility for the spookifying of Salem, Massachusetts. But at the end of the day, there is one person more responsible than any other for what Salem in October has become. Her name is Laurie Cabot. She's a practicing witch, and in 1971, she came to Salem, Massachusetts. She brought with her a small group and opened a witch shop. Now, the buzz around her and her coven was instant. Suddenly, not only were there real witches in Salem, but they were out and proud witches. Cabot went on to open more witch shops and was even declared the official witch of Salem after self-filing a petition to name her as such. Cabot's witch style was clearly influenced by her era and the works of people like Gerald Gardner, and would go on to be foundational stylistically and commercially for every single witch who has migrated to Salem since. When you go to Salem and you pass the 15th witch shop in a row and you're wondering how that happened, Laurie Cabot is how. In 1972, which is 1 year after she moved to Salem, the Salem Witch Museum opened its doors, and you can learn more about how that happened by watching this video if you'd like. A decade later, the first Haunted Happening celebration in Salem was launched by that same museum with the support and engagement of Cabot and her followers. Salem in the 70s and 80s proved to be the perfect cauldron in which to brew a total industry shift. Now, as we've already talked about, the industrial era in Salem was coming to a close. It was a city at this point without a real identity, and by the time the Haunted Happening celebrations got extended from one night to a few days a week to a month-long affair, the Salem that was no more, and the town's new masters were covered in Aquanet and eyeliner. There was a backlash, of course, to the change in the city. It was so rapid and so all-encompassing. People spoke out. A debate began that still rages to this day in Salem. It's a debate about the value of historical diversity, honoring the lives of those who have been viciously murdered, and the preservation of authentic culture versus financial expansion, self-expression, and religious freedom. It's a debate about the nature of witchcraft itself and how it is presented in relation to the Puritans, the local pagans, and the tourists of Salem. It's a debate about outsiders and newcomers. It's a debate about the very soul of a place. And apart from the stalwart efforts of a few outstanding institutions like the Peabody Essex Museum, it sure seems to a fascinated observer that the witches won that debate. By many accounts, 1992 was really the last time the actual event of the Salem witch trials was treated with anything resembling absolute civic and cultural dignity. Now, that was the tercentenary, the 300-year anniversary of the trials. Arthur Miller came in, as well as Elie Wiesel, to speak. There were 2 memorials erected in somber remembrance. And later, about a decade and a half or so later, the site of the actual hangings themselves were confirmed, and it too was memorialized. Now, I wasn't there in 1992, but if you take a look at the memorial that was erected in downtown Salem and you look at pictures and you read accounts from that day, you really do get a sense that this was as respectful of a remembrance as it could possibly be toward the 20 people who were murdered during the Salem witch trials. Unfortunately, this sort of reverent tone didn't last long. In 1993, a new Office of Tourism and Cultural Affairs was founded, and although it initially tried to embrace historical diversity and a more dignified approach, it soon found itself promoting Halloween just as much as its more varied counterparts. Around this time too, the Peabody Essex Museum had already sort of planted its flag in the sand and said, we are going to stand for something different, for a different culture, different history than that relating to Halloween and the 1692 witch trials. So that left a vacuum for other quote-unquote museums to step in and fill the void. We talk about these attractions a lot here on this channel. Some of them are incredible, some of them are not so incredible. But it's important here to understand that an institution like the Peabody Essex Museum is trying to strive for a higher goal than profit alone. And these smaller institutions may or may not be trying to do that same thing. But as of right now in Salem, still, these places can call themselves museums and sort of latch onto that culturally accepted idea of what a museum is without any sort of restriction. So by the mid-90s, you've got witch shops everywhere, you've got these attractions everywhere, you've got people selling shirts. The whole thing has really blown up. So if the 1970s was the beginning of the major events that led to Salem becoming Halloween Central, I think we can pretty comfortably say that the year after the tercentenary, which would be 1993, was the end. By this point, Salem was resembling, or on its way toward resembling, what it is today. Streets were crowded with attractions, haunted happenings has expanded well beyond its initial scope, and tourism has become the central industry in Salem, Massachusetts. Today, Halloween is an absolute free-for-all in 2019. Current estimates claim that around half of Salem's annual tourism comes in the month of October. And I've also read in some places that half of that comes around Halloween itself. I know from my experience, the first time I visited the Witch City was around Halloween, and in truth, that was the entire reason I went. But now that I've seen that there's so much more beneath the surface, I do kind of wish I had known that before the first trip. I've been fortunate to go back to Salem many, many times, but I often do wonder about the 13-year-old girl from central Illinois who visits Salem with her parents on Halloween. With only a weekend on the Salem streets, what conclusions has she drawn as she winds her way back to the airport? Has she been enthralled with a deep, layered cultural history? Has she been enchanted with the sort of surface pizzazz of the whole thing? Has she found a place worth returning to? Or a grotesque amusement, as easily discarded as she gets into her teenage years and early adulthood as all the rest? Whatever side of these questions you ultimately come down on, one thing that cannot be argued is that Salem, Massachusetts is and has been for quite some time Halloween Central USA, and now you know how that happened. Thanks so much for watching this video. Please do subscribe to the channel if you enjoyed it. You can find articles and whatnot at tosalem.com. Hey, spread the word about the witchy stuff we are pushing. It's really incredibly helpful. Everything is going super duper well, so keep doing what you're doing and I'll keep doing what I'm doing. How about that? Stay weird, witches. I'll see you next time.